You know, there are moments in life that hit you with such bewildering force, such unmitigated audacity, that you're left wondering if you've accidentally stumbled into an alternate reality where the laws of logic and decency have been temporarily suspended. For me, that moment arrived via a certified letter, a seemingly innocuous envelope that contained news of such colossal effrontery it almost felt like a practical joke, albeit one conceived by a particularly dim-witted and malicious prankster. The HOA, the self-important gaggle of busybodies presiding over the Harmony Glades subdivision, adjacent to a vast tract of undeveloped land I owned, had apparently sold off 5,000 acres of my property. Yes, you read that correctly. My land. 5,000 acres sold. Without my knowledge, without my consent, without a single damn word. If you're already shaking your head, wondering how such a thing is even possible, strap in, because this story only gets wilder. It turns out, their greed was only matched by their monumental incompetence, and they severely underestimated just who they were messing with. It all started subtly enough, a few years after I'd acquired the sprawling 5,000-acre parcel known locally as Blackwood Reach. It was a beautiful, untouched stretch of rolling hills, mature forests, and a meandering river, bordering the Harmony Glades neighborhood. I'd bought it as a long-term investment, perhaps for a future conservation project, or an extremely private estate, far from the grasping claws of developers. Harmony Glades was a fairly new development, all cookie-cutter houses and suspiciously green lawns. I hadn't paid its internal politics much mind, other than noting the occasional overzealous newsletter that somehow found its way to my mailbox miles away, usually complaining about mismatched garbage cans or improperly trimmed rose bushes. The first sign of trouble, in retrospect, was an almost casual inquiry from a man named Bartholomew Higgins, the HOA president. He called my listed business number, his voice oozing a kind of smug, officious bonhomie that set my teeth on edge instantly. He'd heard I owned Blackwood Reach and wondered if I had any plans to contribute a small portion of it for a new community dog park. I politely but firmly declined, stating the land was private and not available for community projects. His tone chilled perceptibly. "A pity," he'd said, with an undercurrent that hinted more at a threat than regret. "Community spirit is so important, you know." I remember thinking he sounded like a petty tyrant ruling over a kingdom of cul-de-sacs. Little did I know how deep his delusions of grandeur ran. Over the next year, there were other, smaller annoyances. Surveyors I hadn't hired were spotted near my property line, and once I found orange stakes planted a good 50 feet inside my boundary, marking out what looked suspiciously like walking trails. Each time, a call to the HOA, usually getting Barty Higgins himself, resulted in feigned ignorance or condescending assurances that it was all a misunderstanding. They were just beautifying the area, he'd explain, as if doing so on my land was a public service I should be grateful for. I reinforced my no trespassing signs and had my lawyers send a cease and desist, thinking that would be the end of their encroachment. How naive I was. The certified letter that arrived that fateful Tuesday shattered any illusion of petty squabbles. It wasn't from the HOA directly. It was a notification from the county records office regarding a significant land parcel transfer. My parcel. Apparently, Harmony Glades HOA Inc. had filed a quitclaim deed, transferring ownership of the 5,000 acres to a shell corporation named Pinnacle Land Holdings LLC, a company I'd never heard of, for the sum of $100,000. $100,000. For land worth easily 50, perhaps 100 times that. My first reaction was sheer, unadulterated disbelief. I reread the document, my hands starting to shake, my coffee forgotten on the desk. This couldn't be real. It had to be a monumental clerical error, a crossed wire in the bureaucratic labyrinth of the county office. But the details were all there. My parcel number, the precise legal description of Blackwood Reach. The seller was listed as the HOA, with Barty Higgins's flamboyant signature scrawled above President. My vision actually blurred for a moment. not with tears, but with a rage so potent it was almost physically nauseating. How? How could they even attempt such a thing? Did they think I wouldn't notice? That 5,000 acres could just vanish into thin air, without the actual owner raising an eyebrow? The arrogance was breathtaking, galactic in its scope. I immediately called my primary attorney, Marcus Thorne, a man whose calm demeanor was legendary but whose mind was sharper than a crate of freshly honed scalpels. When I explained the situation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Even Marcus, who had seen his share of corporate malfeasance and bizarre legal battles, was momentarily stunned. "They sold your land?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral, but I could hear the undertone of incredulity. "The Harmony Glades HOA? To whom, again?" I gave him the details from the letter. "Pinnacle Land Holdings," he murmured. "Never heard of them. Probably newly formed, likely for this specific transaction. This stinks to high heaven, OP. This isn't just trespass. This is grand larceny on an industrial scale." He promised to start digging immediately, to pull every relevant document, every incorporation paper, every bit of correspondence he could find. Meanwhile, I decided a direct confrontation was in order, not because I expected a resolution, but because I wanted to see the face of the man who thought he could commit such a brazen act of theft. I drove to Harmony Glades, the certified letter clutched in my fist like a weapon. Barty Higgins lived in one of the larger, slightly more ostentatious houses, a flagpole in his yard flying not only the American flag but also, inexplicably, an HOA flag of his own design, a hideous green and beige affair, with a stylized hedge in the center. He was outside, fussing with a rose bush, wearing a truly unfortunate pair of khaki shorts and a polo shirt that was a size too small. When he saw me approaching, a smirk played on his lips, the same smug look he'd had during our phone calls. Well, he said, not even bothering with a greeting. "Come to discuss that dog park again? We found a lovely spot, you know. Very scenic." I held up the letter. "Mr. Higgins," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the furnace blasting inside me. "Perhaps you can explain this. It appears your HOA has sold my 5,000 acres of Blackwood Reach." His smirk didn't falter. If anything, it widened. He gestured dismissively with his pruning shears. "Ah, yes. That old abandoned scrubland. We've put it to much better use, I assure you. It was an eyesore, really, and a fire hazard. The community is much safer, and will soon be wealthier, thanks to our initiative." I felt a vein throb in my temple. My land was not abandoned, Mr. Higgins. It was, and is, privately owned by me. And you had absolutely no legal right to touch it, let alone sell it. He actually chuckled. A short, barking laugh. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, my friend. And as for rights, we have the right to ensure the prosperity and security of Harmony Glades. That land was being hoarded, unproductively. We simply liberated its potential." He said liberated as if he were some kind of folk hero. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it was stunning. He truly believed he was in the right, or at least, he was so committed to the lie he couldn't see a way out. This wasn't just a thief, this was a delusional one. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers, Higgins," I stated, my voice like ice. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." He waved his shears again. "Oh, I'm sure we will. Lawyers love to posture. But the deal is done. The ink is dry. Progress, my friend. You can't stop progress." He turned back to his roses, a picture of smug satisfaction, clearly believing he'd won, that his petty fiefdom had successfully annexed a neighboring territory. He didn't know that his words, his sheer, unapologetic thievery, had just ignited a firestorm. He also didn't know something crucial about Harmony Glades, something I'd been quietly working on for years, completely unrelated to this present crisis. He thought he was the king of his little castle. He had no idea he was merely a tenant in mine. This HOA had declared war, and they were about to find out just how catastrophically outgunned they truly were. The conversation with Barty Higgins, if one could call his condescending monologue a conversation, had solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about recovering my land anymore. This was about dismantling an organization so rotten, so imbued with a sense of entitlement, that it believed it could commit grand fraud in broad daylight. Marcus Thorne, my attorney, was already working at lightning speed. He'd assigned 2 of his best paralegals to deep dive into the county records, the HOA's incorporation documents, their minutes, their financial statements, anything and everything related to Harmony Glades HOA Inc. and this mysterious Pinnacle Land Holdings LLC. The first thing we need to establish is the chain of title for your 5,000 acres. Marcus explained over the phone later that day. It should be straightforward to prove your clear ownership. Then we look at the purported sale. How did they convey title? Was there a forged signature, a fraudulent claim of abandonment or adverse possession, which would be ludicrous on that scale and time frame? This Pinnacle Land Holdings smells like a fresh coat of paint on a rotten plank, likely established by someone connected to the HOA, or someone they think is clever enough to launder the title. While Marcus tackled the fraudulent land sale, I initiated my own parallel investigation, one focused on a peculiar vulnerability of the Harmony Glades HOA, a vulnerability that, until now, had been more of a passive strategic advantage than a weapon in waiting. You see, for several years, long before Higgins and his crew of suburban pirates decided to try and plunder Blackwood Reach, I had been quietly, almost secretively, acquiring properties within the Harmony Glades subdivision. It wasn't for any nefarious purpose initially. The developer had run into financial trouble shortly after the first phase, and a block of unsold lots and newly built homes came onto the market at a very attractive price. I saw a good investment opportunity. Using a series of discreetly named limited liability companies, Staghorn Investments, Willow Creek Properties, Aspen Ridge Holdings, and about half a dozen others, I began buying them up. My instructions to the property management company I used were simple: maintain the properties impeccably, find good tenants, and keep the ownership details strictly confidential. The idea was to hold them as rental investments, diversifying my portfolio. Over time, as individual homeowners in Harmony Glades decided to sell, often frustrated by the increasingly draconian HOA rules under Higgins's tenure, one of my LLCs would quietly make a competitive offer. It was a slow, patient process, conducted through different real estate agents, different closing attorneys, all designed to avoid drawing attention to a single entity consolidating ownership. By the time Higgins decided to sell my 50 acres, unbeknownst to him, or anyone else in Harmony Glades for that matter, my various LLCs owned just over 60% of the homes within the development. Yes, over half the residents paying dues to the Harmony Glades HOA, the people subject to Barty Higgins's pronouncements and fines for unkempt lawns or improperly colored mailboxes, were, in fact, my tenants. This included, amusingly and rather ironically, several members of the HOA board itself, and, as I would soon confirm with a thrill of grim satisfaction, Bartholomew Higgins. He was renting the house from which he lorded over the neighborhood, from a faceless corporation that ultimately led back to me. The deliciousness of that irony was not lost on me, but it also presented a unique angle of attack. An HOA, a homeowners association, derives its power from, well, homeowners. What happens when the vast majority of homes are owned by a single entity, and the people on the board, the people making the decisions, are overwhelmingly tenants with no actual ownership stake in the properties they governed? The term homeowners association itself becomes a farce. I tasked one of my most trusted assistants, Clara, a research wizard with an uncanny ability to navigate Byzantine databases, to meticulously cross-reference the Harmony Glades HOA board member list and their known addresses with the property deeds held by my LLCs. At the same time, Marcus was examining the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC rupees, and its articles of incorporation. There's something very fishy here, OP, Marcus reported a few days later, his voice tinged with excitement. According to their own bylaws, board members must be owners in good standing. It defines an owner as the recorded title holder of a lot. There are provisions for delegation of voting rights if a property is owned by a corporation, but it's very specific. If these board members are indeed tenants, and the actual owner, your LLC, hasn't delegated any such rights to them, then their positions on the board, and any actions taken by that board, could be fundamentally illegitimate. Clara's report landed on my desk the following morning, and it was everything I had hoped for, and more. Of the 5 members on the Harmony Glades HOA board, including President Barty Higgins, Vice President Agnes Periwinkle, a notorious curtain twitcher who fancied herself the neighborhood's moral guardian, and Treasurer Dale Grubbs, a man whose primary qualification seemed to be his ability to scowl at children playing too loudly. All 5 were tenants in properties owned by my LLCs. None of them were homeowners. Not a single one. The Harmony Glades Homeowners Association, the entity that had just attempted to defraud me of 5,000 acres of prime real estate, was effectively a committee of my own renters playing dress-up. They had no legal standing to be on the board, let alone make decisions, levy fines, or most spectacularly, sell land that didn't belong to them. They weren't just thieves, they were illegitimate thieves, operating under a complete fiction of authority. The audacity of it was still shocking, but now it was tinged with an almost comedic absurdity. Barty Higgins, strutting around issuing edicts about lawn gnome placement, was doing so from a house I owned, all while orchestrating the theft of my other, much larger, property. It was like a very poorly written play, but the consequences were all too real. Marcus was practically salivating when I shared Clara's findings. "This is it, OP! This is the golden ticket!" he exclaimed. "Forget just suing them for the fraudulent land transfer. We can challenge the very legitimacy of every action this board has ever taken. Their authority is built on sand. We can argue that the HOA, as it currently operates, and as it has operated for the duration of this board's tenure, is a sham." The path forward was becoming clearer, and far more satisfying than simply getting my land back. The fraudulent sale was the bait, but the real prize was the complete implosion of the Harmony Glades HOA and the public humiliation of Barty Higgins and his cronies. They had tried to steal from me, operating from a position of false authority derived from properties I owned. It was time to demonstrate to them, in no uncertain terms, who the actual homeowner in Harmony Glades was. The strategy was forming. First, legally obliterate their claim to Blackwood Reach. Second, expose the illegitimacy of the current HOA board. Third was the part that would involve the state. And it was the most audacious of all, a perfectly proportionate response to their own colossal nerve. This was no longer just business, it was a masterclass in consequences they were about to attend. The investigation into Pinnacle Land Holdings LLC, the supposed buyer of my 5,000 acres, yielded results almost comically quickly. As Marcus suspected, it was a freshly minted entity, incorporated just 3 weeks before the fraudulent land transfer. Its registered agent was a low-rent law firm known for handling shady incorporations, and its listed address was a P.O. box. However, a little more digging by Marcus's team, cross-referencing with financial disclosures the HOA had sloppily filed in previous unrelated minor disputes, revealed a connection. The initial funding for Pinnacle, a meager $10,000, was traced back to a business account held by none other than Dale Grubbs, the HOA treasurer, and the sole director of Pinnacle, a certain Gerald Finstock who, after a bit more sleuthing through social media and local news archives, turned out to be Barty Higgins's brother-in-law, a man with a string of failed small businesses and a penchant for get-rich-quick schemes. It was almost laughably amateurish. Higgins, Grubbs, and presumably the other board members had conspired to sell my land to a company controlled by Higgins' relative, likely planning to quickly flip it for a massive profit and divide the spoils, leaving the HOA itself with a pittance of the actual value, assuming even that pittance would be properly accounted for. It was a classic case of self-dealing and fraud, wrapped in layers of incompetence. Marcus immediately prepared an emergency injunction to halt any further transactions or development on Blackwood Reach, citing clear title in my name and evidence of a fraudulent conveyance. He also prepared a comprehensive lawsuit against Harmony Glades HOA Inc., Bartholomew Higgins, Agnes Periwinkle, Dale Grubbs, the other two board members, Mildred McMillan and Gary Stumps, Gerald Finstock, and Pinnacle Land Holdings LLC, alleging fraud, conspiracy, unjust enrichment, slander of title, and seeking not only the immediate return of my property, but also significant punitive damages. We'll bury them in discovery requests alone, Marcus said with grim satisfaction. The beauty of their scheme is its crudeness. They haven't covered their tracks because they don't think they need to. Higgins genuinely believes he's untouchable. While Marcus sharpened his legal knives, I focused on the second, more delicate part of the plan: leveraging my ownership of the majority of Harmony Glades properties. The realization that the entire HOA board was comprised of my tenants, individuals who had no legal standing as homeowners under the HOA's own covenants, conditions, and restrictions, was the key. The CCRs were very clear. Board members shall be owners in good standing. An owner shall mean the record title holder of any lot. Furthermore, voting rights for any lot owned by a corporation or other legal entity shall be exercised by such person as shall be designated in writing by the owner. My LLCs, the actual owners, had never designated Bartholomew Higgins, Agnes Periwinkle, Dale Grubbs, Mildred McMillan, or Gary Stumps to act or vote on their behalf. Their entire tenure, every rule they'd passed, every fine they'd levied, every decision they'd made, was built upon a foundation of quicksand. But I couldn't just march in and declare them illegitimate. That would be messy and could get bogged down in procedural wrangling. No, the takedown had to be elegant, legal, and undeniable. This is where the full extent of my quiet acquisitions in Harmony Glades became truly strategic. With over 60% of the properties under the control of my various LLCs, I effectively was the Harmony Glades Homeowners Association, or at least, I held the supermajority of voting power. The current board, comprised of tenants, had been operating in a vacuum, a self-perpetuating clique, because the actual majority homeowner, me, through my LLCs, had remained silent and unengaged in HOA politics. Until now, the plan began to crystallize. It wasn't enough to simply reclaim Blackwood Reach and sue the individuals involved. I wanted to dismantle the entire rotten structure Higgins had built, the one that allowed this farce to happen. And if, in the process, I could highlight the fundamental absurdity of their authority, all the better. My next step was to instruct my property management company, very discreetly, to review the lease agreements for Higgins, Periwinkle, Grubbs, McMillan, and Stumps. Specifically, I was looking for any clauses related to community conduct, misrepresentation, or activities that could bring the property or landlord into disrepute. While using their tenancies as a platform to commit felony land fraud probably wasn't explicitly forbidden in the boilerplate leases, their broader actions, as HOA board members operating without legitimate homeowner status, certainly constituted a gross violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of fair dealing. But even simpler was the fact that their leases, like most, had terms, and those terms would eventually come up for renewal, or not. The more immediate path, however, was to utilize the voting power inherent in owning over 60% of the lots. According to the HOA bylaws, a special meeting of the homeowners could be called by members holding at least 25% of the total vote. My LLCs collectively held more than double that. We could call a meeting, and at that meeting, my designated representatives for each LLC could vote to remove the current board for cause, namely, their lack of legitimate homeowner status and their recent foray into grand larceny, and elect a new interim board, one entirely controlled by me. This new board could then formally acknowledge the fraudulent nature of the Blackwood Reach sale, cooperate fully with my lawsuit against the individuals, and, most importantly, begin the process of examining and potentially dissolving the HOA itself, or at least radically reforming its bylaws to prevent such abuses from ever happening again. I discussed this with Marcus. "It's a sound strategy," he affirmed. "You're using their own rules against them. Once your LLCs formally designate their representatives and cast their votes, the current board's position becomes utterly untenable. They can squawk all they like, but they'll have no legal leg to stand on." The beauty of this approach was its precision. It wasn't a hostile takeover in the traditional sense. It was the legitimate exercise of ownership rights that had simply lain dormant. Higgins and his cronies had grown accustomed to wielding power unchecked, never imagining that the quiet, anonymous corporate landlords of so many properties in their domain were, in fact, a single, coordinated entity that could, at any moment, awaken and assert its dominance. The letters started going out. Formal notices from Staghorn Investments LLC, Willow Creek Properties LLC, Aspen Ridge Holdings LLC, and all the others, sent to the registered address of the Harmony Glades HOA. Each letter, legally drafted by Marcus's team, designated a specific individual, carefully chosen employees of my holding company, people of utmost discretion and loyalty, as the official voting representative for that LLC's properties. Then, a master letter, pooling the collective voting power, formally called for an emergency special meeting of the homeowners of Harmony Glades. The agenda item was singular: to discuss and vote upon the removal of the current board of directors due to ineligibility and gross malfeasance, and to elect an interim board of directors. The letter specified the date, time, and location: a conference room I'd booked at a neutral downtown hotel, far from the oppressive coziness of the Harmony Glades Community Clubhouse, where Higgins usually held court. Copies were also sent via certified mail to Higgins, Periwinkle, Grubbs, McMillan, and Stumps at their respective my addresses. I could almost imagine the scene: Barty Higgins, perhaps after a satisfying morning of bullying a resident about the precise shade of their mailbox, receiving a series of stern, official-looking envelopes. The slow dawning of confusion, then perhaps irritation, and finally, as the implications of so many powerful, hitherto silent corporate homeowners suddenly speaking with one voice began to sink in, a creeping sense of dread. He had poked a bear he didn't even know existed, and that bear owned the forest, the cave, and the honeypot he was currently living in. The trap was not just set. The first steel jaws were beginning to close. The days leading up to the emergency special meeting were thick with a strange kind of anticipation. Marcus's lawsuit regarding Blackwood Reach had been filed, and the injunction preventing any activity on the land was granted almost immediately by a judge who, after a brief review of my undeniable chain of title and the ludicrously low sale price to Pinnacle Land Holdings, raised a skeptical eyebrow that could have frozen lava. News of the lawsuit undoubtedly reached Higgins and his board, but their public response was muted, likely on the panicked advice of whatever cut-rate attorney they'd managed to scrape together. Internally, however, I could only imagine the frantic scrambling. The real bombshell for them, I suspected, was still the upcoming special meeting and the dawning realization that the ground beneath their little HOA empire was not only shaking but was about to liquefy completely. My team had prepared meticulously. Each of my LLCs had a designated proxy, an employee of my main holding company, thoroughly briefed and armed with irrefutable documentation of their LLC's property ownership within Harmony Glades. We controlled, by conservative estimates, around 63% of the total possible votes in the HOA. The HOA bylaws stipulated that a quorum was 30% of homeowners and decisions were made by a simple majority of votes cast. We didn't just have a majority, we had a landslide. The evening of the meeting arrived. I chose not to attend personally, preferring to orchestrate from a distance. Marcus was there, not as my direct representative, but as an observer with a keen interest in corporate governance, and a briefcase full of evidence should anyone question the legitimacy of our LLC's claims. My designated proxies, a team of 5 sharp professional individuals led by a woman named Ms. Anya Sharma, my head of asset management, arrived at the downtown hotel conference room looking more like they were attending a high-level corporate negotiation than a suburban HOA showdown. The conference room was sterile, a far cry from the chintzy, community-feel Harmony Glades clubhouse. Barty Higgins arrived with his full board in tow, Agnes Periwinkle clutching her pearls as if expecting a barbarian invasion, Dale Grubbs looking even more dyspeptic than usual, and the other two, Macmillan and Stumps, looking frankly bewildered and out of their depth. They were accompanied by a nervous-looking local lawyer, a Mr. Fillmore, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Perhaps about 20 other actual homeowners from Harmony Glades were present, a mix of curious onlookers and a few long-suffering residents who had privately expressed their dismay over Higgins's reign but felt powerless to act. Anya Sharma, calm and collected, called the meeting to order precisely on time. She introduced herself and her colleagues as the duly appointed representatives of various corporate homeowners, collectively holding a majority voting interest. Mr. Fillmore, on behalf of Higgins, immediately tried to challenge this, blustering about outside interference and hostile takeovers. Anya, without raising her voice, simply presented the stack of notarized proxy forms and certified copies of property deeds for each LLC. She then politely invited Mr. Fillmore to scrutinize them. As Fillmore and a visibly sweating Higgins began to flip through the sheer volume of paperwork, the color drained from Higgins's face. The meticulous documentation, property by property, LLC by LLC, painted an undeniable picture. This wasn't an ambush, it was an audit, and they were failing spectacularly. As you can see, Mr. Fillmore, Anya stated coolly, the entities we represent are legitimate homeowners within Harmony Glades, cumulatively holding, let me see. She did a quick, performative tally. Approximately 63% of the total voting rights. We are well within our rights to call this meeting and to propose the items on the agenda. The air in the room was thick. Higgins was sputtering. Something about predatory capitalists and destroying community values. Agnes Periwinkle was muttering about the sheer nerve. Dale Grubbs just stared at the documents, his jaw slack. The few independent homeowners present were watching with a mixture of shock and dawning, incredulous hope. Anya moved to the first agenda item, the motion to remove the current board. She laid out the grounds succinctly. First, the clear ineligibility of all current board members, as none are owners as defined by the CC Rupees. They are tenants, and the actual property owners, our LLCs, never delegated any authority to them to serve. Second, gross malfeasance, specifically citing the recent unauthorized and fraudulent attempt to convey common interest property and, more significantly, private property adjacent to the community, namely the Blackwood Reach parcel. An action which has exposed this HOA to significant legal and financial liabilities. Higgins leapt to his feet. This is an outrage, a travesty. We have served this community faithfully. That Blackwood Reach land was blighted. We acted in the best interests of Harmony Glades. His voice was cracking. Anya simply looked at him. Mr. Higgins, your service is predicated on your legitimate standing as a board member. Our records, and indeed the public property records, indicate you are a tenant at 12 Pickett Lane, a property owned by Staghorn Investments LLC. Staghorn Investments has not authorized you to act as a board member. The same applies to Messrs. Periwinkle, Grubbs, Macmillan, and Stumps, with respect to their tenancies in properties owned by Willow Creek Properties, Aspen Ridge Holdings, and so on. Therefore, under the HOA's own governing documents, your entire board is illegitimate. A gasp went through the room, especially from the independent homeowners. This was the smoking gun, laid bare. Their neighborhood emperor not only had no clothes but didn't even own the palace. The vote was called. Anya, on behalf of the collective LLCs, cast 63% of the votes in favor of removal. The other independent homeowners, emboldened, mostly voted in favor too, bringing the total to well over 70%. It was a crushing defeat. Higgins, Periwinkle, Grubbs, Macmillan, and Stumps were in an instant no longer the board of the Harmony Glades HOA. They were just 5 stunned individuals. Anya then moved to the election of an interim board. She nominated herself and 2 of her colleagues. The vote was, naturally, a formality. The new, legitimate Harmony Glades HOA board was now comprised of my most trusted people. Their first act, proposed by Anya, and seconded immediately, a resolution to formally declare the purported sale of Blackwood Reach to Pinnacle Land Holdings LLC null and void, to fully cooperate with all legal actions to recover said property and pursue damages against the individuals responsible for the fraudulent transaction, and to undertake a full audit of the HOA's financials and governing documents. It passed unanimously. Among the new board, of course, Higgins looked like he'd been poleaxed. Agnes Periwinkle was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Dale Grubbs actually looked greenish. Their lawyer, Mr. Fillmore, seemed to be trying to shrink into his ill-fitting suit. The entire meeting had taken less than an hour. It was a masterclass in legal precision. But the best part, the real pièce de résistance, was yet to come. As the meeting adjourned, and the shell-shocked ex-board members began to shuffle out, my primary property manager, a calm but firm gentleman named Mr. Henderson, who had been waiting quietly at the back, stepped forward. He approached Barty Higgins. "Mr. Higgins," he said, his voice polite but unwavering, "I am Robert Henderson, with Premium Property Management, representing Staghorn Investments LLC, the owner of your residence at 12 Pickett Lane." Higgins stared at him blankly, the name of the LLC, probably just then connecting with Anya's earlier statements. "Mr. LLC," Henderson continued, "given recent developments and certain actions which reflect poorly on the tenancy, Staghorn Investments has decided not to renew your current lease, which expires at the end of next month. You will receive formal written notification within 48 hours. This also applies to Ms. Periwinkle, Mr. Grubbs, Ms. McMillan, and Mr. Stumps with regard to their respective leases with Willow Creek Properties and Aspen Ridge Holdings." That was the sound of the other shoe dropping, or rather, 5 shoes, simultaneously. Not only had their HOA kingdom crumbled, but they were also being evicted from their homes, legally, quietly, and with devastating finality. The looks on their faces were a cocktail of disbelief, fury, and dawning, desperate panic. Barty Higgins opened his mouth, then closed it again, words failing him for perhaps the first time in his adult life. He had tried to steal my kingdom. I had just taken away his cardboard castle and the very roof over his head. The fallout from that emergency special meeting was swift and deeply satisfying. The lawsuit regarding Blackwood Reach proceeded with the full, unreserved cooperation of the new Harmony Glades HOA board, which was, of course, my board. Anya Sharma and her team, acting as the interim directors, passed resolutions acknowledging the utter invalidity of the attempted sale, providing affidavits, and basically handing Marcus every piece of internal HOA correspondence related to the Finstock Pinnacle Land Holdings debacle. Barty Higgins, Gerald Finstock, and Dale Grubbs found themselves not only named in my civil suit but also under investigation by the local district attorney's office for fraud and conspiracy. After Marcus made a polite but firm presentation of the evidence to them, the threat of criminal charges seemed to suck all the remaining bluster out of Higgins. His attempted land grab, orchestrated with such smug confidence, was collapsing into a personal and legal catastrophe for him and his cronies. Pinnacle Land Holdings LLC, that flimsy vessel for their greed, dissolved even faster than it had been formed, its assets, essentially zero, apart from the initial seed money from Grubbs, which was now frozen, effectively forfeit. Blackwood Reach was officially, and with a great deal of public record correction, mine again, unencumbered and untouched, though the saga had certainly added a layer of notoriety to its history. But the true beauty of the plan extended beyond simply reclaiming my land and punishing the individual perpetrators. It was about addressing the systemic rot within Harmony Glades and executing the final, most impactful phase of my response. The eviction notices, delivered with cold, legal precision, sent shockwaves through the former board. Higgins, Periwinkle, Grubbs, McMillan, and Stumps suddenly found themselves stripped of their faux authority and facing the very real prospect of homelessness. Their appeals to Mr. Henderson, my property manager, were met with polite but implacable refusals. The property owners have made their decision based on a comprehensive review of the tenancy and recent events, was his standard, infuriatingly calm reply. There were no grounds for them to fight the non-renewal of their leases. The contracts were clear, and the LLCs were simply exercising their rights as landlords. They had 30 days to vacate. Watching their petty tyrannies unravel was, I admit, a source of considerable vindication. Agnes Periwinkle, who once terrorized residents for leaving their garbage cans out an hour too early, was now frantically searching for a new rental that would accept her 3 yappy Pomeranians. Dale Grubbs, whose scowl could curdle milk, was seen arguing with a moving company over their rates. And Barty Higgins, the deposed king of the cul-de-sac, was a shadow of his former self, his khaki shorts and officious demeanor replaced by a hunted look and slumped shoulders. He'd gambled big and lost everything, including the very home from which he'd plotted his little empire. With the old board gone and my interim board in place, the full audit of the HOA's finances and operations began. It revealed years of minor mismanagement, petty graft, and preferential treatment for friends of the board, but nothing quite on the scale of the Blackwood Reach heist that had been their grand finale, their masterpiece of incompetence and greed. The most significant finding, however, reinforced what we already knew. The HOA, for years, had been run by tenants, not homeowners, making almost all its major decisions, contracts, and special assessments legally questionable. The few actual independent homeowners in Harmony Glades, initially bewildered by the sudden corporate takeover, quickly became supportive when they realized the extent of the previous board's deceptions and the precarious legal footing their HOA had been on. They had been ruled by a committee that had no right to rule. Now came the final act. With my LLCs controlling over 60% of the properties and the old, illegitimate HOA structure dismantled, we had a unique opportunity. Harmony Glades, as a community, was in limbo. Its governing body had been proven a sham. What was its future? My original plan, even before the Blackwood Reach fiasco, had been long-term investment, but the actions of Higgins and his board had left a foul taste in my mouth. The entire concept of this particular HOA felt tainted beyond repair. And then, the idea struck me. An elegant solution that would not only resolve the Harmony Glades situation permanently, but also serve as a rather spectacular final gesture of, let's call it, corrective action. Blackwood Reach, my 5,000 acres, was pristine natural land. It bordered a state park to the north. Harmony Glades itself, while a typical suburban development, was nestled in a rather scenic valley. What if it could all serve a greater public good, free from the clutches of any future Barty Higginses? I instructed Anya Sharma and Marcus Thorne to prepare a proposal. We would consolidate the ownership of all the LLC-held properties in Harmony Glades under a single new trust. This trust would then approach the State Department of Environmental Protection and the State Park Service. The proposal was audacious. The trust would offer to sell the entirety of its holdings in Harmony Glades, dozens of houses, the common areas, everything, plus the newly secured 5,000 acres of Blackwood Reach to the state, for a fair market value, but with the stipulation that Blackwood Reach be annexed to the existing state park and that the Harmony Glades properties be repurposed, perhaps for park ranger housing, an environmental education center, or even carefully managed, affordable public ecotourism cabins, with the existing infrastructure leveraged for minimal environmental impact. The key was, it would become public land, managed by the state, forever protected from the kind of petty tyranny and fraudulent schemes that had characterized the Harmony Glades HOA. The state officials were, initially, taken aback by the sheer scale of the offer. But as they examined the pristine nature of Blackwood Reach, its ecological value, and the potential for expanding public access and amenities via the existing Harmony Glades infrastructure, their interest grew. The valuation process was complex, the negotiations meticulous, but the underlying logic was sound. This was a chance to significantly expand public parkland and recreational opportunities, using an existing developed footprint responsibly. It took nearly a year, but the deal was eventually struck. The state of Transylvania, let's call it that, shall we, purchased Blackwood Reach and the majority of Harmony Glades. The independent homeowners who remained in Harmony Glades were given fair buyout offers by the state as part of the overall project, or offered long-term lease agreements if their properties were incorporated into the new park plan. Most chose the buyout. Harmony Glades, as a private residential subdivision with an HOA, ceased to exist. It became the Blackwood Reach Gateway, an extension of the state park system. The houses where Higgins, Periwinkle, and Grubbs once lived and lorded were now slated to become lodgings for visiting botanists and park staff. The community clubhouse, site of so many of Higgins's officious pronouncements, was being remodeled into a visitor orientation center for the expanded Blackwood Reach State Park. My revenge was complete, and it was far more comprehensive than merely getting my land back. I hadn't just defeated an HOA, I had legally and systematically unraveled it, exposed its fraudulent core, evicted its corrupt leadership from homes I owned, and then, as a final flourish, sold the entire neighborhood out from under its very concept, turning it into something that would serve the public good, forever free of HOA shenanigans. Bartholomew Higgins, last I heard, was working a low-level clerical job in another county, his dreams of real estate grandeur reduced to sorting mail. The other former board members scattered to the winds, their Harmony Glades reign a rapidly fading, embarrassing memory. Sometimes, when people try to steal from you, a simple lawsuit isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to make sure they understand the full scope of their error by dismantling their entire world, legally, piece by piece, and then repurposing the rubble for something better. It's a lot of work, but the view from the moral high ground, especially when it overlooks 5,000 acres of your beautifully preserved land now part of a public park, is quite something. And it all started because an HOA president thought he could sell something that wasn't his. He found out the hard way that some homeowners have considerably more reach and considerably more patience for protracted, legally sound vengeance than he ever imagined. The dust from the Harmony Glades implosion took a while to settle, not in a literal sense, but in the annals of local gossip and legal cautionary tales. The news that an entire subdivision had effectively been dissolved and sold to the state park system was, to put it mildly, unprecedented in our region. My name, or rather, the names of my various LLCs and the overarching trust, were mentioned in somewhat odd, somewhat bewildered tones in local planning department meetings for months. The beauty of the final solution was its thoroughness. It wasn't just a punitive strike, it was a constructive transformation. Blackwood Reach was now permanently protected, its pristine forests and waterways secured for public enjoyment and ecological preservation, something I'd always vaguely intended but which the HOA's actions had massively accelerated and expanded in scope. The former Harmony Glades, now the Blackwood Reach Gateway, was slowly morphing. The cookie-cutter houses, stripped of their HOA-mandated uniformity, the endless beige-on-beige color palettes, the prescribed flower beds, were being adapted for their new public-facing roles. Some became quaint rental cabins for park visitors, offering a unique in-park lodging experience. Others were converted into research facilities for university students studying the expanded park's diverse biome. The old HOA clubhouse, once a temple to petty rules and Barty Higgins's ego, was now bustling with families picking up trail maps and children learning about local wildlife at interactive exhibits. It was a far cry from discussions about the appropriate height of lawn grass or the sin of displaying a non-regulation garden gnome. The irony was palpable and immensely satisfying. The independent homeowners who had chosen the state's buyout offer moved on. Most of them, I heard, quite happy to be free of the HOA drama and with a tidy sum in their pockets. A few who loved their homes and the location opted for the long-term lease agreements, becoming, in essence, tenants of the state park system, a landlord infinitely more preferable and certainly more legitimate than the Higgins regime. Their relief at the demise of the old HOA was palpable. Some even sent anonymous thank you notes to my business address, addressed to the anonymous benefactor of Harmony Glade's liberation. I allowed myself a small private smile at those. As for Bartholomew Higgins and his cohort of deposed despots, their downfall was complete. Higgins, stripped of his presidency, his home, and his dignity, reportedly had a difficult time adjusting to life outside his bubble of self-importance. The district attorney's investigation into fraud and conspiracy eventually led to plea bargains for him and Dale Grubbs. No jail time, unfortunately. Their lawyer managed to argue monumental stupidity rather than pure criminal mastermind intent, but hefty fines, probation, and a permanent stain on their records. Gerald Finstock, Higgins's brother-in-law and the face of Pinnacle Land Holdings, faded back into whatever obscurity he'd crawled out of, his brief career as a fraudulent land baron over before it began. Agnes Periwinkle, I heard through the grapevine, moved in with a reluctant sister in a neighboring state, her pearl-clutching days in Harmony Glades now a distant memory. The whole affair served as a stark lesson in the perils of overreach and the illusion of power. They had believed themselves untouchable, lords of their little cul-de-sac kingdom, never imagining that their arbitrary rules and inflated sense of authority could be so thoroughly and legally dismantled by the very homeowners they presumed to govern, or in this case, the single, disguised mega-homeowner. The meticulous planning, the patient acquisition of properties, the carefully timed legal maneuvers, it had all been a massive undertaking, a chess game played out over years, and then accelerated to a stunning checkmate. Marcus Thorne, my attorney, often referred to it as the suburban coup d'etat, and privately admitted it was one of the most satisfying cases of his career, not for the financial returns, but for the sheer elegance of the victory and the righteous dismantling of such a brazenly corrupt little entity. He even framed a copy of the Harmony Glades HOA flag, that hideous green and beige monstrosity, for his office wall, labeling it the spoils of micro-war. Looking back, the financial cost of buying up most of a neighborhood and then essentially donating a significant portion of its value to the state by selling at a fair but not hyper-inflated price was considerable. But the return on investment, measured in justice, satisfaction, and the permanent removal of a blight, both the HOA and the potential for irresponsible development on Blackwood Reach, was incalculable. It reinforced a core belief of mine. When confronted with bullies and thieves, especially those who weaponize petty authority, the response must be disproportionately intelligent, overwhelmingly legal, and utterly definitive. You don't just slap their hand. You dismantle their entire platform for misbehavior, so they can never bother anyone again. Sometimes, people ask me if it was all worth it, the time, the expense, the sheer effort involved in what amounted to a very personal and very public takedown of a neighborhood association. My answer is always an unequivocal yes. It wasn't just about my 50 acres. It was about the principle. It was about the fact that people like Barty Higgins and his ilk believe they can operate with impunity, preying on others through manipulation of rules and sheer audacity. They count on victims being too bewildered, too intimidated, or too financially constrained to fight back effectively. They certainly never expect their target to own most of their power base and have the resources to legally burn it to the ground. So, if you ever find yourself dealing with an HOA run by power-drunk tyrants who think the rules don't apply to them, remember the story of Harmony Glades. Remember that even the most entrenched-seeming fiefdoms can be brought down with careful planning, superior resources, and an absolute refusal to back down when you know you're in the right. And always check who actually owns the houses. You might be surprised. For me, Blackwood Reach Gateway stands as a monument not just to nature's beauty, but to the sweet, sweet taste of disproportionate, perfectly legal, and ultimately public-spirited revenge. It was a complex series of moves, but selling their neighborhood to the state after they tried to steal my land and discovering their entire HOA was an illegal sham built on my own properties? chef's kiss. Absolute chef's kiss. The ripples of the Harmony Glades affair extended further than I initially anticipated, serving as something of a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among real estate developers, city planners, and, most deliciously, other HOA boards in the wider region. Stories, as they often do, got slightly embellished in the retelling. I became a mysterious, shadowy figure, the HOA slayer in some circles, a quiet investor who turned an entire subdivision into a state park out of sheer, magnificent pique. While pique certainly played a part, it was more a calculated, strategic dismantling born of righteous indignation. The true beauty of the outcome was its permanence. No new HOA could ever rise from the ashes of Harmony Glades, because Harmony Glades, the residential entity, no longer existed. Its land, its infrastructure, its very identity had been fundamentally altered, subsumed into the larger, public-serving embrace of the Blackwood Reach State Park. This, for me, was the ultimate victory, not just winning the battle, but changing the landscape so the war could never be fought again on that particular patch of ground. The financial intricacies of the sale to the state were complex, but fair. My goal hadn't been to extract maximum profit, but to achieve a specific, irrevocable outcome. The funds received were substantial, of course, covering my initial investments in the Harmony Glades properties and Blackwood Reach, plus a reasonable return. But the real profit was intangible, the satisfaction of seeing a corrupt system legally obliterated, and a beautiful piece of land preserved and enhanced for public use. My interim board, led by Anya Sharma, had managed the transition with remarkable efficiency. Once the sale to the state was finalized, their duties as HOA board members naturally concluded. They returned to their regular roles within my holding company, each with a hefty bonus and a fantastic story to tell about the time they briefly governed a suburban neighborhood before legally auctioning it off to the government. Anya, in particular, had relished her role as the polite, implacable enforcer of bylaws against those who had so carelessly flaunted them. She kept a small, laminated copy of Barty Higgins' signature from the fraudulent deed as a paperweight, a reminder of the audacity that had set the whole chain of events in motion. One amusing side effect was the sudden, almost panicked review of bylaws and board member eligibility in several neighboring HOAs. Word had gotten out about the tenant board vulnerability that had been so critical to the Harmony Glades unraveling. Other HOAs, perhaps with similarly lax oversight or board members whose homeowner status was questionable, were reportedly scrambling to ensure their own houses were in order, metaphorically and literally. It seemed the Harmony Glades saga had inadvertently sparked a small wave of HOA governance reform in the county, which I considered an unintended but welcome public service. Occasionally, I would drive out to the new Blackwood Reach Gateway, park my car, and walk the trails. Sometimes I'd see families enjoying the picnic areas that were once meticulously manicured and fiercely regulated front lawns. I'd observe park rangers leading nature walks where Agnes Periwinkle once patrolled for perceived infractions of community standards. The transformation was profound. The air itself felt different, lighter, free from the oppressive weight of petty rules and the judgmental gaze of self-appointed guardians. It was a testament to what could be achieved when a line was crossed so egregiously that a truly seismic response was warranted. Bartholomew Higgins, during his probation, was legally obligated to stay far away from anything related to Harmony Glades or Blackwood Reach. I often wondered if he ever saw news articles about the thriving state park expansion, about the positive impact it was having on the local community and tourism. I wondered if he ever reflected on the fact that his attempt to illicitly pocket a quick profit from my land had resulted in him losing his home, his reputation, and inadvertently contributing to the creation of a public good he could never have envisioned or appreciated. The state, for its part, proved to be an excellent steward. They embraced the vision for the Blackwood Reach Gateway, investing in sustainable infrastructure, educational programs, and careful habitat restoration. The former homes were respectfully adapted, maintaining a semblance of a neighborhood feel but repurposed for park functions. It was a model of adaptive reuse, turning a problematic private development into a public asset. The scale of the revenge, I admit, was grand. Selling an entire neighborhood after legally seizing control of its HOA because its illegitimate tenant-based board tried to steal my adjacent land is not exactly a standard playbook response. But their crime, attempting to defraud me of 50 acres, was equally grand in its audacity. It required a response of equal, if not greater, vision and finality. They wanted my land? I took their entire world, then gave it to everyone. There's a certain poetry to that, I think. And to anyone out there facing their own HOA nightmare, while your circumstances may not involve owning the majority of the properties or having 5,000 acres stolen, let this story be a small beacon. Document everything. Know your rights and theirs. Understand the bylaws better than they do. And never underestimate the power of a well-executed, legally sound strategy. Sometimes, the biggest bullies are perched on the shakiest foundations. All it takes is one determined homeowner, or in my case, one very determined clandestine majority landowner, to give it a firm, targeted push. The satisfaction of watching it all come tumbling down, and then building something better from the wreckage, is a reward all its own. And yes, ensuring those responsible face legal consequences and eviction? That was the cherry, the whipped cream, and the sprinkles on top of a very large, very satisfying sundae of justice.